Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. I know there was so much going on yesterday evening, so well done to you for getting up so early to hear the words of wisdom from our panel. So what an amazing subject we're going to be talking about today. It's a bit of a gift for me. This is the first time that I'm participating at this meeting. And I am a reporter. I work on TV, and I've covered a lot of conflict zones in my time. So I've described this world which is being turned upside down and is unpredictable. And on France Info, I was listening to someone who was talking about the world order that has been in place since 1945, which has been exploded to shreds. So let's see what our experts have to say. Today we've got Mr. Drian with us, who is currently the French president's representative for the Lebanon, used to be Minister for Foreign Affairs and for Defense. And you are intimate with Donald Trump's government. You negotiated nuclear accords with the Iranian. You've met Lavrov, the Russian, on the telephone just a few days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you're currently working with Lebanon. So tell us, what on earth has happened to multilateralism? And what are the perspectives for successful international relations? Pierre Heilbronn, you too are a special envoy of France's president, but for aiding and reconstructing the Ukraine, which is in war and has been for the past 4 years because of the Russian invasion. So this morning we're going to be talking about sovereignty and responsibility. So how is Ukraine managing to protect its sovereignty? It's an important question for us and for Europe, which is getting fresh weapons. Philippe Val, you have made the post office an officer of sovereignty. So digital ID is thanks to you. You've always defended the role of public services. Today you're at the head of an institute called Imagine, which works on genetic illnesses. And you will tell us how we can counter the American giants and the New World Order. You've got some ideas which you're looking forward to sharing with us this morning. Jean-Dominique Senard, good morning to you. You are the CEO of Renault, the Renault Group, with 110,000 employees all around the world, which is very impressive. It is a jewel in the French crown. So is sovereignty... will sovereignty be guaranteed thanks to cars or to war? Renault produces drones for the French army now. And you're going to be talking to us about corporate responsibility. And you wrote a report on this in 2018, which seems like a century ago. The world has changed so much. So there we are. I've introduced my panelists. We've got Hippolyte Albis from the Cercle des Économistes, who helped me prepare this round table. And when we were preparing it, we said, OK, on Saturday, it's the 4th of July. What do we all think of when we say 4th of July? In 2026, it's the 250th anniversary of American independence. 250 years ago, just a handful of men decided that they would change destiny. And that's our subject, being sovereign, being independent. So, Hippolyte, you have chosen to say a couple of words about that this morning. Thank you very much, and yes. Yeah, indeed. We tend to say that the world is uncertain, rather dangerous, but in objective terms, 250 years ago, for the uprisings in the US, who were against the biggest colonial power in the world, started a war that was to last 7 years. The world was very dangerous and uncertain for them. The interesting thing back then was that in opposing the colonial text, they produced a written document, which is almost a philosophical work. And it's that written document, which is very famous, which they're celebrating now, They're not celebrating the military success or a building or anything. They're celebrating a written document. In this document, there's a question of sovereignty. Of course, it's a declaration of independence. So they're breaking their ties with Great Britain. And when you read this document, there is a need to justify their sovereignty. That's what you read in between the lines. They're not after sovereignty for sovereignty's sake or power for power's sake. They are looking for, they're demanding sovereignty for a more noble cause, which is to protect the right of the peoples and the right to be happy. And I think today, at a time when we're talking a lot about sovereignty, let's not forget that major message, which is what is the point of sovereignty. And it's also a question of responsibility in this same document, because the rulers have to protect the rights of those they govern, and those who are governed have the responsibility of changing their government if the government in place is not satisfying those goals or reaching those goals. It's all written in the document there. They have to do it, but they have to do it for real causes, not pointless causes, and you mustn't do it too often either. Given what's going on over recent years, I think that is something which is very, very important. Of course, for over 250 years, the world has changed immensely. We know that exchanges are becoming international. There's an interdependence of the different economies. They're exchanging different goods. That's structured our world, and it's structured the way we think about the world. We got used to the idea that this interdependency produces not only wealth which is shared, the wealth of absolutely everybody, but it also produces stability, it produces an order. The tricky thing is for those countries that are not within this system of goods exchanges, for example, but those who are in the system are protected and participate in something which is stable. That is no longer true. And there are three important factors here. Three characteristics of the current world. Firstly, interdependency between economics is no longer producing peace. We've seen this with Russia. The fact that Russia depends on having a lot of clients to sell its infrastructures, that did not prevent Russia from going ahead and attacking a sovereign state and to upset the rest of the international community. Interdependence is perceived today as a source of vulnerability. We're worried because we're not going to be able to get all of these different critical materials or access to different parts of the world. Now, another point which is very important is security has become an economic goal. We have put in place, we're using great effort to weaponize ourselves again, to get fresh weapons. It's also a question of organizing expertise and financing. Third point, today's world sees the return of the states, which spearhead this need for sovereignty, but they have to deal with another power, which is technological and economic power. We see that China and the states are aligning. There's this economic and political power which are realigning, and that is the secret to power. So that's my introduction to this subject. Let's not forget the spirit of Jefferson and the Declaration of the United States. Sovereignty, yes, but why? And what is the purpose of sovereignty? Thank you for listening. Mr. Le Drian, as Hippolyte has just said, after 1945, and thanks to trade exchanges, we thought that we would be enjoying peace for a long, long time. So what went wrong? Why is sovereignty under threat today? And what could set things straight. Or to come back to what Hippolyte has just said, and to illustrate the new landscape in the United States, and to contradict the values of the Declaration of Independence, I'd like to quote Donald Trump's latest declaration, which is quite typical of today's period. The only limit to my power is my own sense of morals, which is a rather strong declaration by Donald Trump when he was being interviewed by the New York Times a short while ago. And it shows that fundamental values are being called into question, including the values of the United States, in the very year when we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of its existence. And when take a closer look, it's the 250th anniversary, and today is also the day of the funerals of Ayatollah Khamenei. And that's not by chance that these happen the same day. There'll be 1 million people in Iran who are going to demonstrate. And France Info, my radio station, is there on the ground. It's starting this morning, and it's no coincidence. Now, what's gone wrong? There's an absence of a place and a methodology to solve problems peacefully. Before, there was a methodology, that was the Security Council, and there was a principle, which was that of negotiation. But the methodology no longer works. A short time ago, it was a period when the Security Council could have resolutions on questions such as Mali and other sensitive issues, Iranian nuclear power. One can't imagine that that Security Council can come to any conclusion on the Iranian nuclear power today. Today, that's just fizzling out now. It's just the Security Council is just out of step with the reality in the world, and also pertaining to principles, because today the major subject is peace through strength or force. Netanyahu's taken that up, Trump's taken that up, and it is enshrined in the national security strategy of the United States. It's peace through strength or force, not by negotiation, and it's not going to work. You always have to go back to negotiation, as we have seen many, many times. So it's the end of Pacific settling of problems. The second observation is a question of borders. The inviolability of borders. We've got Ukraine, Greenland. You could also mention that borders are no longer respected. And different treaties that we all agreed about are now null and void. There was the treaty on nuclear weapons. It no longer exists. That treaty is no longer respected. It no longer exists. There's also a treaty on conventional forces and exchanging conventional forces, and more historical ones such as on the climate. So we're just poo-pooing them now if they don't align with our own interests. So it's an end to those sets of rules. I would also add another thing which has changed, is the fact that Atlantic schism is here, is existing. There's going to be a NATO meeting in Turkey next year, but that breach has been observed. There's a breach after many years of convergence between the states, United States and Europe, since Wilson in 1918. So there's this breach which is absolutely obvious. And I'm coming back to what Hippolyte was saying again. Free trade as a vector of globalization, that's null and void. Also, the period where geopolitics and geoeconomics were in parallel, that's smashed. And today, we have tariff wars and high subsidies for others. I would also add that truth itself is called into question, and the relativity of truth, including scientific truth. There are a lot of false accusations going around about Ukraine, where the Russians are saying that Ukraine was the attacker. So if there's no truth, how on earth can we come to any kind of agreement? So the panorama is rather disappointing. It's rather depressing even for a Saturday morning. But let's take stock of the situation. But there are some components which mean that we can have a glimmer of optimism. We absolutely have to regulate spaces today that are not being regulated. We all realize that we have to find the right path to do that, whether we're talking about the climate, the oceans, digital technologies. So we're all looking for a path to get out of this situation. We've got these COP meetings, these conferences of parties on different subjects. The COPs don't lay down the standards, but they are an encouragement. And that's why it's so important and useful to develop these bodies, because if we don't work with them, where on earth can we find a path forward? So we really do need to regulate. And we talk about all different ways of doing it. At the end of the day, we have people taking stances on questions of health or digital technologies, whereas Trump announced that multilateralism is dead and buried. So there are some paths forward which are starting to become clearer. There's partial multilateralism, but perhaps we could develop in the future.
Second, there are a lot of countries that refuse to get into this announced confrontation between China and the US. They don't want to be part of this alignment, and they're looking for another way. I'm thinking about India, Indonesia. We can give many examples. I'm thinking about the speech of McCarthy, the Prime Minister of Canada, where he announced the necessity to disobey the force of to push for the strength of middle-sized powers, and the Europeans, on the other hand, the Europeans, only if they make sure that they know how to use sovereignty and power. It's not just about claiming sovereignty if you don't have the power that goes behind it, and the Europeans are looking to go down that path. If you gather the three positive points that I just mentioned, we can hope to have a more calm session this morning. So, Philippe Val, we're talking about your readings, and you read for us an author from Singapore. He's a diplomat. He's not an enemy of the West, but he's a very critical friend. And he says today the Western countries have lost the rest of the world. Why is this statement, which is a bit disturbing for us to hear, why should we awaken us? It should awaken us because it should give us hope as well. Because speaking after Jean-Yves Le Drian, I find reasons for hope if we use the long-term approach. Before we talk about sovereignty and responsibility, I would like to talk about being real. Being real, I'm not going to give you my own reading of being real, but this is the words of a Singaporean diplomat which chairs the Security Council. His name is Kaushanemi Shobani, and he wrote a remarkable book, which is how can the West have lost the game? And it's very critical. It's a very critical book, and he says that the world has shifted. Our world has shifted. And the emergence of China is a sign not of the tipping of the world. It's already done and dusted. So he tells the Western countries, he said, your time is gone. And you need to take this, like every effort of being real and seeing reality, as a chance to seize the opportunities that lie ahead of us. And if you look at Putin and the war, it shows that he's in denial. style. And Mr. Trump, Jean-Yves Le Drian described him, he wants to keep his empire, such as Putin. He fights Iran, but he hasn't won the war. The world has shifted. Let's start with this assessment. The world as we used to know it has shifted. And we're no longer strong or sovereign, and we can only reach for power if we have done the right diagnostic of our situation, which means giving up with on the past. So it sounds paradoxical, but national sovereignty will go with alliances. But throughout centuries, forging Europe has been a way to assure our sovereignty. If you all turn your look to an island very close to us, an old nation that loves us very much, the UK, Brexit made them go away from Europe, and they lost power and they lost sovereignty by doing that. They've just showed it to us. So Europe will remain our way to remain sovereign. It has to be a Europe that affirms its economic power. Of course, being in a competition with the US and China is there, but they also affirm a vision of the world that is different. It's not an imperialistic Europe. We have been empires. Remember that. We have had our empires. We don't have any imperialistic project, but Europe has stuff to bring to the table. And something simple, among others, Kishumima Shubani is reminding us of this. It is responsibility that we can bring. What does he suggest? It's always interesting to look how others look at us. And he first starts by saying, you have values, please defend them, but stop schooling us. We're Westerners. We have to understand that from Singapore to India to Africa and Indonesia, people don't like to be schooled and told what to do. And we spend our whole life telling people what to do. Let's try to build partnerships instead. So we should really develop a Europe made of partnerships. And I believe that the key point here is to remind everyone, and Hippolyte mentioned it in his introduction, that since we live in the same planet, we have a common destiny. So the idea would be that Europe, as a power, would be at the service, not at their imperialistic goals such as the US, China, Russia, but Europe should serve the common fate of the planet. And common fate, we have many on the topic of health, education, which is completely upended by AI, and also above everything else, because it defines how we live, how we're going to live in the planet, the question of sustainable development and climate. And if us, as an economic power and a sovereign power, become autonomous versus the United States, and the divide with the other part of the Atlantic forces us to conquer our autonomy. We shouldn't ask for others to defend us. Yesterday it was the US that was defending us. Today it's Ukraine. At some point, we're going to have to face ourselves the question of our own defense. And not a defense to be imperialistic, but just to protect the common fate of humanity. So the questions of climate, biodiversity, future of the planet could regroup a lot of those middle-sized powers, because the challenge is the rest of the world. The emerging world it's divided between China and the US. And we have a part to play in this game, and reaffirming a world and humanistic responsibility could be a European project. In any event, let's remember, when we think long-term, about a sentence of Jean-Baptiste Durosel, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was a great French diplomat. Any empire will die or perish. So let's not look for imperialistic strategies, because the empires are doomed. Let's look for a sovereignty that would be serving the common fate of humanity, and that could get a lot of people on board. Thank you very much. If you allow me, I would like to add another thing about empires. A nation never forgets that it's been an empire. Hence the temptation of some. And so let's move to Ukraine, Pierre. You were there 15 days ago. I was sent to Ukraine when the war broke out, and I heard a lot. I listened to the Ukrainians saying that they had a regret. In 1994, we signed the Budapest Treaty, and we gave our weapons back, nuclear weapons back. In exchange, we were assured, and not guaranteed, but we were assured that we would be defended. Isn't it a regret, a strong regret that they have, that they gave up on their sovereignty, as like Ukraine did? Is it a lesson for the rest of the world, by the way, that nobody else is going to do that any longer, to give up your nuclear weapons? And from what you can watch, how do the Ukrainians manage to defend their sovereignty while they're fighting a terrible war against the Russians? Ukraine is at the same time the border of our world and a source of inspiration for us, for what we are, for what Europe is about, and an inspiration to build a European sovereignty. I don't want to go back on the upending of, well, the disruption of the world that was very well described by Mr. Minister. We will never stress enough how we've entered a world of uncertainty and instability, and it's really a very deep disruption. Disruption from the idea that nurtured us since forever, the economic interdependence and the deepening of democracies was necessarily going to lead to a pacified relationship between nations and peoples. At the same time, this is the original inspiration of the project of Europe itself, the one that led us to having so many years of peace and prosperity on the continent. What I'm going to draw from the experience lived this last years, I've been about 30 times in Ukraine, in all regions of the country, to meet Ukrainians in all their diversity. Is that, first of all, sovereignty is not just a concept, but that it hinges on something very deep, on a capacity to defend your territory, a capacity to keep producing energy when all the infrastructures have been destroyed, having a telecommunications network, hospitals that keep working under bombs. An adaptation of every moment that is based on a collective conscience, a common fate. So when Philippe talked about being real, it's being real on the group that is formed by people who were doing different things before and who just the armed force of Ukraine are made of lawyers, chairmen of company, and anybody willing to take up weapons. We've lived that in the history of France. So beyond the courage of the soldiers, it shows the courage of all these people, engineers and entrepreneurs, to get organized and mobilized together to defend their country. Second point, I think that's very important as well, the sovereignty is being built, has to be built. It's a feeling of vulnerability that leads to it, this fragility as well, That was also the awareness after 2014 helped them build this capacity to resist after 2022. And they also have the notion that they have to build, very patiently the foundations of this sovereignty, and you cannot wait, just keep waiting for people to step in for you and help you bring you fresh weapons. Things have to be prepared ahead of time. And I think the Ukrainians understood that very well, and that explains how they resisted in 2022. They understand how eras are changing, and what really struck me, particularly when you come from Paris, is they could last for 3 months or for 30 years. That's how we look at them. It's something we discovered in 44, 45 with the resistance, the French resistance, that was actually planting the seeds for the France of tomorrow. It's a fundamental element as well on the construction of this sovereignty. And the last word I would like to say, the Ukrainian experience must lead us to look at our European future in a different way. And not only like some do very often, like to show Ukraine as a moral imperative or a country to defend at all costs. I think it's an incredible piece of luck for Europe to open their eyes on their own potential. It's a strategic asset for Europe, of course, in terms of Donald Trump, with all his excesses, conclude this agreement on critical minerals. But instead of complaining of what others do, mostly America, it's a chance for Europe to harness their own fate. And it's also a pact of partnership for Europe to make sure that Ukraine can become a strategic asset in Europe. And that has to go through a very candid and open discussion with our Ukrainian friends, because France is the first army on the continent. Ukraine has a railroad company that could be a source of inspiration. And it could be a source of inspiration for our public companies to watch what they do. And that shows that sovereignty is not about isolating oneself, but to be able to choose freely your alliance and to build your own future. We're going to ask you later on how Ukraine's sovereignty is going to play out over time, depending on Starlink, depending on the Americans, how Ukraine is going to get out of it. Jean-Dominique Sénard, you're the only CEO or chairman of this panel. And I would like to know your point of view and your perspective. What is the responsibility of a group such as the one that you lead in a world that has shifted, when one day we may have to prepare ourselves to defend our own country? So you said that in 2018, socially responsible capitalism is a chance for Europe. Very good. At the same time, the world has changed, and with the competition coming from China, isn't it a luxury today to declare yourself as responsible? Thank you for this huge topic that you're handing me with. I would like to start with the world of the company and what can companies, the big C, what can they do in a chaotic world in terms of sovereignty and responsibility. I would like to pass down 3 messages. The first one is companies are not discovering geopolitics. It's a topic that is as old as the world. We're not going to tell you about the story of the Company of India, but we know the role that they were playing on the geopolitical side. We're not going to talk about the big oil international companies as well in the last century. You all know the history, your history. But geopolitics today dominate the economy, and it's not a discovery for the world of corporate people. We live it every day. I could give you thousands of examples of the company, including the one that I have the honor to chair, that is facing geopolitics. The minister knows it, the exit of the Renault Group from Russia because of the events, 40,000 people of the group that had to stay, stayed back in Russia, and it shaped our recent history. And I'm not talking about Iran, but at moments we even wondered if companies had their own diplomacy, and the answer is no. Companies are following international treaties, but they navigate in this very, very chaotic universe. This is our everyday life. We've never needed more sovereignty than we do now. And when I say we, I'm talking about Europe, because this is what we're talking about. We really need to make sure that this famous sovereignty that everybody talks about is not something that we keep waiting for, but we really make it happen. When we talk about sovereignty, my belief is that we can only achieve it in a global way. It's a conjunction of the military power, economic power, and political power. For me, the three have to be united. If you miss out on one of them, the issue of sovereignty is starting to fizzle. In the world, if you talk about companies beyond the power states, the companies are so huge and that they go beyond the states themselves.
There are some companies with turnover which is bigger than France's GDP. And their worth on the stock exchange is much higher than it. Dizzying. The role of those businesses is to be wondered about. So let's keep in mind that in the context I've just described, our challenges have suddenly increased in size, because everything which has been described by my fellow panelists is true. But today, a business, such as the business I take care of, but all businesses, we are in such a new situation that the challenges we face are so different. Dare I mention the pressure from China on our own industries? I could talk about the car industry, of course. That pressure is huge, but it's all the stronger because Chinese companies benefit from circumstances which are very clear. They receive support, and today in Europe is open. It's open to absolutely anybody. We have certain circumstances whereby competition is imposed upon us. When we're talking about Chinese cars, they are unfurling like a tidal wave across Europe. And the levels of competition, beg a question. So that changes the paradigm. If we are not supported by European sovereignty in this field, it will be harder for us to rise to the challenges. I'm not saying we're not going to rise to the challenges, but I will say it will be harder for us. And we really have to insist that Europe gets a grip of the situation, because it's part of our strategy of autonomy. I prefer to talk about autonomy rather than sovereignty, and it's in danger. My third message is that if we don't want to spend our time squabbling with China and the States, it is going to be necessary in Europe for us to tie in responsibility with sovereignty. Sovereignty is a function of power. From a business point of view, I'm thinking of defense in Europe, industry in Europe, the defense industry in Europe. So sovereignty is a denominator of power, and it's also essential to have power. It's great to talk about strong Europe, but in a strong Europe, the different component states have to be strong, and in those strong states, the businesses must be strong. And that requires a lot of effort to be competitive and to help businesses so that they can defend themselves in the world I'm describing. If we forget that power is a question of what I've just been talking about, then we've got things wrong. So responsibility is essential. So in Europe, we've got an amazing piece of good fortune. We have our unique culture, and we don't want to lose it. Our economic culture, which has been laid down by the Rome Treaty, but existed even before then. The social rules of markets. We are not in the capitalistic state of the English-speaking world, which has led to great problems, particularly when you're talking about deindustrialization. We are not in Asian-style state capitalism, which uses the weapons of capitalism in an aggressive manner. We are in Europe, and we're fortunate to be in Europe. We can say that we have responsible capitalism. We have the right to talk about it and to support it, and European institutions have to develop them and help us in that. Capitalism is, in the long term, which includes social issues, is at the very heart of the market. That is our strength. That is our culture. Let's not lose that culture. And I would say that I hope, really do, that businesses will embrace that. And if they can do that, it will be so important for what's going to happen in the future and our relationship to our own environment. And may institutions, European institutions, really take this on board. Today, I believe they're not doing it sufficiently. And in my eyes, that conjugation between responsibility and sovereignty is the very foundation of the future of our own sovereignty. So, strategic autonomy as opposed to sovereignty then. I hear you advocating this, but we're not going to be able to be sovereign in all areas. Do we not have to take some choices? Renault is producing drones today. Did the state ask you to do that? Or did you just think it was a good business opportunity? But should we not accept that we'll have to drive Chinese cars and just drop that sector here in France so that we can invest in weapons? If I say yes to this question, I think I won't have a job when I turn up at the office on Monday. The question of sovereignty, and my fellow panelists are experts in this field, what I would like to say is, yes, you're right. Being sovereign today does not mean that you're autonomous on all fronts. That will never be the case. You need so much time to become strategically autonomous with your rare earths, etc. So we are fighting, we have a circular economy, we're going to do what it takes, but we know, let's be clear about this, we will never manage, or not within the next 10, 15 years, to say that we are autonomous in these areas. On the other hand, and this is the role of Europe, we can be sovereign if we have a sector, a key sector. So despite, above and beyond all the big markets, where Europe can be respected, because this is the subject. If we've got this weapon, we don't live in La La Land. We know that we have to close that source of graphite because we need batteries. Our factories are in danger. How many ores, how many rare metals are in question, and China dominates there. If we have one field where Europe cannot be beaten, well, then that relationship of force will change. Hydrogen, for example. Hydrogen is a resource, a possible resource, and if we invest hundreds of millions of euros in that here in Europe, then we would be looking at our strategy differently. There are some sectors for the future. We could invest massively in a single field of research so that in 5 years Europe will be absolutely a key player. I think that's what we need to do today because we don't really have the choice. Talking about Chinese cars, driving Renault cars, no, heaven forbid. The Renaults are out there today. We've got some wonderful Renault cars. They're great. Philippe, I believe that you are talking about sovereignty to an absurd measure. If we're in a market economy, if we're exchanging our goods, then you cannot be sovereign all over. It's the very essence of the market economy to go and buy stuff from other people, to be dependent on others. However, let's do that with a clear, level mind, and let's do that remembering that the European project is to defend the very destiny of humanity. There are 9 billion of us on this planet. Let's defend our common destiny by deploying our strategy in different fields, but let's not dream of sovereignty everywhere. It's contradictory with the market economy and with trade exchange. Admittedly, however, let's look reality in the face. Mr. Le Drian, we have made progress in European defence today. However, the contracts we sign are with the Americans. We purchase American weapons with European money. You have to build your sovereignty, public contract after public contract. Yeah, sovereignty for Europeans is first and foremost making sure that we are secure. The rest is just trimmings. If the Europeans do not prove that they themselves have their own strategic autonomy, that they can make themselves safe, then we will just, miss a major opportunity. We'll ruin our own destiny. Let's get back to Trump there and the Russian attack on Ukraine. These two things are helping us directly, immensely, to become aware. We're all becoming aware today because what does it mean being secure and making sure that Europe defends itself? This is not just pie in the sky. We have to have the financial resources to do these things. Do we agree that our financial efforts for each state in the European Union and in NATO, are we all agreeing to make those necessary efforts? We're hesitant, but we are making progress. Things are moving forward in Poland, in Germany, which has changed its tune. There's a change in France. They're doubling the defence budget. It's twice the amount I had when I was Minister of Defence. So, yes, we need to have enough resources and we need to share. We need to talk with our citizens. It's not an easy battle, but we must wage it. And if we have funding from European taxpayers, that fund has to be pooled. We're not doing that yet. We can do that within the Atlantic Alliance without even if the Americans aren't a partner of that. It is possible. There is no other platform for doing that. What works today is to have a strong European pillar in NATO with real interoperability, and I think it's possible, it's on the table. Third point, we have to make sure that industry and technology are reinforced for the defence sector. We've got all the technologies we need. We haven't rationalised them all. They're perhaps a bit scattered in different European countries and they're perhaps not totally coherent, but we do have quality and high performance levels, as high performing as the best Americans. We just need to believe in ourselves. And that really is on the table. We've got 4 minutes left, which is good. 1 minute for each of you for a final question, which will jettison us towards the French presidential elections. You're all saying the situation is pressing. Okay, so what should the first initiative be that the new president should take in France to guarantee French sovereignty. One thing to do, one symbolic gesture or an action. I have to answer? Okay, short answer. I think when the new president goes and takes office, I think he or she must do two things. Firstly, go to Berlin to... Yes, it is a tradition, of course, but it's also necessary. It's not just protocol. So we have to go now to show that European sovereignty is anchored by France and Germany, and we must not forget that. And from Germany, I would go to Kiev on the same day. And I would say our security is here and Ukraine is with us. I would say that one of the keys is to construct and to put back on the table this question of Franco-German cooperation. We have accentuated the fragmentation of the European market because of public finances. But I think this bilateral side must be strengthened. And Berlin is absolutely key, as is Kiev. Because our ability here, our capacity here in Europe depends a lot on the capacity that we have to build with Ukraine that sovereignty. So, Philippe, why don't you hand out this book written by your Singapore author? But what is the best gesture? Well, I can't say anything more intelligent than my fellow panelists. It's not my specialist field. But I think that the new president must remember that history is long. And getting France and Europe back on their feet again is possible. And our destiny is in our hands. Mr. Senna, you talked about sovereignty and responsibility. So how can we make sure that we can bring it all together above and beyond patriotism? I'm kind of perhaps out of step with my fellow panelists here, but what I would do, or what I would hope a president would do on the day they take office, that is to get together all of the associations of the French youth, civilian, military, etc., to give them hope, give youngsters hope, because it's the youngsters who will shoulder the future of our country, and we have to fill them with trust and confidence, trust in what we can do together, so that in the future those youngsters will participate in French politics, will vote at different elections, and will feel totally included in our own sovereignty. Thank you very much. So let's speak about this next year to see what our future president...
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session called Identifying Methods of Financing for a World at Peace. This is a bit of a provocation, isn't it? Because we live in a world that is anything but at peace. So our speakers are going to tell you how the geopolitical context of today, which is a complicated context, is impacting their institutions, and they're going to go back to the solutions. Do we need to be more creative to fund projects? Because we live in a world that is more complex than before. Let me introduce your panelist, Jacob von Weizsäcker, who's Minister of Finance and Science of Saar in Germany. We have Odile Renaud Bassot, President of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian, who's the head of the French office of the EIB. And we have Paulo Correa, who's Executive Director for Brazil and Suriname of the BID, the Inter-American Development Bank. Pierre Jacquet, who's a member of the Cercle des Économistes, and he will introduce the session and let us understand what is at stake here today. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, we don't live in a world at peace, so if you really want to be provocative, to prepare for peace, let's prepare the war and finance our defense, basically. So we see that there's a very strong pressure on us to increase on our defense capacities. That was, I was being a bit controversial here, but building a world of peace takes much more than that. What is the role of international financing to go back to world at peace? A fundamental question is what is the raison d'être of international financing? Why countries, no matter what they are, have an interest in freeing up some resources to fund some international goals that could be development, solidarity, but also common goods like climate or other public goods that have that are emerging for some of them. So we changed our regime, the multilateral framework in which we're living, which was a world where the states had put in place a strategy of cooperation to obtain common goals. And this, unfortunately, is the world that is no longer universal, because some big powers have decided that the pursuit of common goals was going in the opposite direction than their own personal interests, and that jeopardizes the whole structure of governance of globalization. You can name those powers, can't you, Pierre? I can name them, of course. There's the United States first, but we can see that the shift is visible in numbers. The public aid for development has dropped for the first time ever, minus 25% in real numbers, after a drop already in 2024 of 6%. And this is going to continue. So this drop in the United States, well, the United States accounts for 75% of this debt. So that means the other countries, France, UK, Germany, Japan, have to compensate for it. And the flows of solidarity have narrowed down. If we compare the volumes funded that keep being provided mostly by the traditional donor countries, this disruption gives even more important role to other actors such as China, which is now the first debtor in the world for many years now, and some other powers that we could call middle powers. We're not going to go back to the world as it used to be. One of the questions that this panel can tackle is what strategy should we adopt in those conditions. If we live in a world of multilateralism, there's many things that were beautiful that were created in the past. How do we preserve them? How do we preserve what has been done? Is it the only possible approach, or is the strategy about creating a new world by forging new alliances and identifying new goals? And in a context where the budgets are narrowing down, it's a very important question to solve. So let's not dream here. I think an important question is, why should we fund international goals? For solidarity reasons. And contrary to what we may believe when we conduct opinion surveys, there's a majority of the population that continues to believe and be favorable to supporting international solidarity. But in a context of budgetary constraints, it's difficult because we'll need to preserve our resources. So we need to reestablish the link between international funding and politics. Politics not to defend just the companies of our own country, but to think about the construction of new alliances. If we finance something, it has, of course, a geopolitical impact. It builds networks of friendships that allow us to go beyond the funding and let us do things together. We need to construct new coalitions together. Beyond all of that, the major problem in our world remains the same, is that we have an economic interdependence that is a reality, even if the politics of the bigger powers is aiming at getting it back for themselves. But this economic interdependence should force us to think about allocating resources internationally, but how to manage crisis and how to redistribute the resources. And we're very far from that. But we can keep trying to build this utopia, particularly in the current situation. But I think the question has become very political. How can we build new networks of alliances, particularly without the United States at the moment, but let's not give up on doing it again, or building, in the meantime, coalitions with other countries, middle-sized countries. This is the idea of the Canadian Prime Minister. But understanding first that funding goes way beyond just the simple financing objectives. Funding is a political act. Thank you, Pierre. We're going to start with the political man of this panel, Jacob von Weizsäcker. You're Minister of Finance and Science of Saarland in Germany. I'd like to introduce you a bit because you come from the SPD party and you start one of the most striking reforms of the decade in Germany, because it was about reforming this block to debting by creating a special fund of 500 billion euros over 12 years, financed by debt, by borrowing, which is François de Gallo calls the historic turning point for Germany and for Europe. So you thought there was a major turn of 180-degree turn in Germany. How do you perceive this geopolitical context, and what impact does it have in the choices of financing, particularly to finance common good? I will start by saying I would like to remind you to really appreciate the global institutions that we have at hand, the World Bank and the IMF. For now, we cannot recreate them, so there are some issues and there's some situations where the U.S. can block some decisions. However, for a number of common goods, global common goods, it's extremely important to have them. So even if it is not just a matter of funding, the fact that today there's no universal protectionism, it's thanks to the WTO, sorry. Even if there's a crisis in our global world, we're lucky that there's a few institutions that are remaining that can still take decisions. It's becoming more and more difficult, but let's not forget the fact that we have them, and we need to keep investing in those institutions, keeping in mind that they cannot give everything that you would want them to give. And second point, in this global disorder, if I could call it that way, we need to create some clubs between countries, and Europe can play a key role in this role to create clubs of countries to, even if it's not about global common goods, but it could be common goods belonging to the club, or that could have can become global. For example, if today, I'll give you a concrete example, if the WHO is going through a crisis at the moment because the United States left this organization, we can imagine that some other countries can create their own clubs to produce vaccines. And all the countries that are a member of that particular club could have access to those vaccines. It doesn't mean that you have to be rich to be in the club. It could also include a few developing countries in these clubs. So the club logic seems important to me. Third point, there's some domains where there's a real urgency to act. And this is a reason why I was in favor of an easing of the budget rules in budgetary policy in Germany in terms of digital technologies, media, and safety. There's a real urgency to act. And we really have to be pragmatic. We need to do what works. Of course, we need to think, but not overthink it either. We need to create institutions, but not too complex ones. Let's not waste too much time to manage to do that. We need to use a form of variable geometry. Thank you very much. Odile Renaud-Bassot, you're chairing the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD. You're the first woman to chair this institution. You've been also the first chair of the Treasury in France. You worked among the European Commission for many years. The EBRD is an institution that is multilateral, but we know that it was created at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, so it represents some values to try to push these countries to adopt a market economy. There's some democratic values within the EBRD. How do these values and your functioning is impacted by this new geopolitical context, which is a world of bilateralism and the rule of force? For the EBRD, considering the history of bank, which was created when the Berlin Wall fell down, the opening to the fall of communist countries and these countries opening up to market economy, the EBRD wanted to support them in this transition. And we have a real shock now because we have two major shareholders, which Russia and Ukraine. They were playing a very important role in our institution, and it was upended by the war, the attack of Russia. So we're kind of impacted by this shock. But what matters today is how, beyond this complete change of environment, how do we adjust? And how do institutions, as the EBRD, manage to adjust in this new environment? In 2014, when Russia started to attack Crimea and annex Crimea, we stopped. We were the major investor in Russia. We invested millions of dollars and of euros per year in Russia. We stopped it altogether. And in 2022, with the war of Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, we went to another step, and we continue to invest in a country at war, which is for a development bank is not an obvious thing to do. The first idea is to worry about, we invest in a country that we don't know if it's going to be standing on its 2 feet tomorrow. So we managed to find the right support with the help of the shareholders to keep investing in a country at war and to help them reconstruct infrastructures that were bombed, help companies to continue developing their business in a world at war, which really shows that we can be very agile. There's a country with an IMF program is the premier. In a way, it shows that the adaptability of the institutions with ways of governance that allow us to keep making decisions because we have rules of majority. We don't need to reach a consensus between all countries to be able to act. And this is a great strength for us. Americans, for example, are the first shareholders of the BRD with more than 10% of shares. But we have a lot of European countries as well as shareholders among themselves, plus the EBI. They are also shareholders, and we have a very controversial question with the US is climate questions. But the majority of the shareholders backing this goal have continued to give it priority to this action, even the opposition of one shareholder. It doesn't mean that the Americans are out of the BRD. They're still shareholders. They continue to participate in the debate. It's not all black or all white. We have a priority for the bank, which is the improvement of the governance in the countries where we operate. So the governance of public sector, the state of law, fighting against corruption. This is part of your values, isn't it? Yes. Transparent management of companies. How can we ensure good management of public money? This priority has always been ours, but we insist more and more on it, and the Americans are supporting us on that. So this is the variable geometry map that Jacob was mentioning. It's an institution that is going to reach, some domains reach consensus, some domains there are going to be countries voting against, but it still works because we can deliver by delivering support to the countries where we operate and by taking part in trying to provide global common goods. Sorry. What about your support to Ukraine? Was it a political decision on the EBRD side to continue investing in a country at war and to get out of Russia?
Yes, that was a decision which we took with our shareholders. It was a political decision. So Ukraine needed support, economic support. We are not at all involved in the military side of things. Our shareholders are not supporting any financing of military actions, but we support businesses, infrastructures, which are so important for the country to keep operating. So that was a decision which was very political, which we took with our board of directors and our shareholders. Would you like to come back to what's just been said? Yeah. In France, we've been talking a lot about how public debt for development should evolve in the future. I think what Pierre Jacquet said about the importance of solidarity and also the global interests of our country, these are areas where we have to continue to invest because we have economic interests, but also because the stability of neighboring countries, Mediterranean countries and sub-Saharan countries, their stability is so fundamental for European stability. So our approach is often focusing on the interests of businesses and the economy, but often it's important to underline the importance of stability and the development of countries around us for the prosperity of our own country and for Europe in general. Grégoire Chevrier-Le Drian, you are the head of the EIB. The EIB is the financial arm of the European Union with 27 shareholding countries. Airbus, for example, is going to receive $3 billion loan from the EIB. We learned that in the newspapers 3 days ago. This is a record amount. So in this political and geopolitical impact, how does it impact the EIB's choices? Well, financial institutes have different mandates. The EBRD and the EIB have different mandates, although they do overlap in some areas. I think we are convinced that our investments made by these institutions, enable to ward off crises, to reduce breaches and to prepare the future. And I think that's one of the roles of the European Bank. We have 27 member states. We have a mandate to invest in the European key strategies inside Europe and outside Europe, beyond its borders. And in a world which is constantly changing, the member states, our shareholders, want the institution to do more and more of this, to act given all of these crises that are cropping up increasingly. And so the institution has increased its investments so that we don't step in for, but we can accompany investments by member states. So the 27 have to make a budget that's quite unique. So what you do and it's quite interesting to say, it's nothing to do with the individual budgets of each country. A lot of the budgets are in the red. Yeah, obviously there are some budgetary difficulties around, and often one associates European funding with subsidies, with aid. But the EIB's model is completely different. We are a bank. There is no budgetary transfer from the countries to us. We have bonds. We have the best score, AAA score. So it just shows that Europe is better. 3 A's is better than the score of most of our member states. So we have the best possible score. So 27 together is stronger than each state on its own. So we put bonds out on the market and we finance them as cheaply as possible at competitive rates. Because we're a public institution such as the EBRD, we're not aiming for profit. What we want is for the projects which we invest in, the different sectors we choose to invest in, can get finance at competitive rates and over a long period of time, because a long-term investment is what is going to guarantee lasting peace, if we can hope for that one day, because these investments are in health, infrastructures, education, interconnection. These are investments which are preparing the future and will guarantee, we hope, the convergence of our different economies, cohesion between different countries, which are factors of peace and stability. Paulo Correa, you work for the Inter-American Development Bank. For a long time, you were an economist with the World Bank. So Brazil and Latin America are very interesting to you today. Your institution is multilateral. Your Inter-American Development Bank has a main shareholder who is the United States. We learned yesterday that the World Bank is abandoning the target of 45% of funding in the green economy under pressure of the Trump administration. So what's the impact on you?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I have learned a lot in the last 2 days. It's really a pleasure to be here. So to go straight to your question, the first outcome is that I think it's very likely that we will have to consider how to do. We do have targets for climate financing. We are committed to finance 47 to 50%. 47 to 50% of all the financing that we do. EIB, EBRD also have targets, but I think we're going to have to change those very quickly. Now, the good news is that... The good news is that this is not, it does not imply that climate financing will necessarily decline for developing countries. As far as the risk country ownerships, in other words, that the countries go to those banks and to the IDB and request funding for projects related to resilience, to mitigation, and any other areas, there is a commitment that these resources will be available. So the narrative, it doesn't look good. In fact, the commitments are important because to a large extent, climate financing in the past years has been dependent on the MDB's financing. This is a commitment at the Paris Agreement of all MDBs. So it is important, but not having them does not imply that the climate financing will decrease. I wanted to make one more comment related to a developing country perspective and the issue of clubs. And we do need development finance, which is finance beyond climate finance. We need other sustainable development goals, and for that we need finance. So, and resources are drying up. As you know, just for climate, we need 1.3 trillion. In Baku, we only managed to commit to 300 billion. A lot of this money comes from OECD countries, ODA, and this is declining, as we heard in the beginning. Brazil tried to push ahead in the G20 and in COP30 with two ideas of compulsory financing from either taxes, like maritime taxes that would finance climate finance, or wealth taxes that would finance the fight against extreme poverty and hunger. Politically, these things didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. Now, the point is that the geometry, the foundations of the current global architecture for development finance is in disarray. It's based on voluntary contributions for different reasons. It is declining. Coordination and multilateralism, which is not fashionable in many, for many governments right now. And finally, rule of law. So since we don't have all that, so we need really the idea of clubs, etc. But I wanted to highlight one point that I'd like to come back later, which is also we need to prioritize better. There is too much fragmentation. There is too many objectives, different ways to apply for these resources internationally. We need better target, better focus to be able to scale up. And I will, if I have time, I will argue later on that one of these objectives should be the elimination of extreme poverty. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur le ministre, alors, juste...
Mr. Minister, your answer to that. In this second part, we would like to know what kind of tools are being put forward in this rather complicated world. We've understood how it works. We understand that you are unorthodox. You, the Germans, do you have any unorthodox tools to offer to the rest of us? I'm going to start by noting that there are new global public goods. And I'm going to stress the question of digital technologies and AI, but also the media. I think we are underestimating the extent to which they influence not only the way our democracies function in Europe, throughout Europe, but also it has a huge impact on our capacity as a global community to cooperate. It really is important. There is an intellectual job of work to be done. Institutions have to roll up their sleeves. We need regulations as well. And we also need to work with the private sector to come up with some better solutions. And one way of looking at this is to say that we have a digital economy that is which is taking up all of our attention. Like us here on the panel, I hope we're attracting all of your attention. The commercial stakes are high. And so if you've got a mindset that's focusing on knowledge, on enlightenment, if you like, that is the digital economy, which doesn't necessarily have the same commercial advantages as other models, more democratic, more open models. Possibly democratic. But the question is, as individuals and as a society, are we taking our decisions based on knowledge? Or are we taking our decisions based on reflex? Let me give you an example here. When internet was first invented, there was that idea that internet was going to link all of our brains together and make a huge, very powerful brain that would arrive at the best decisions. But today, we get the feeling that that is the case in some ways, but we're linking very old parts of the brain, no new parts of the brain. And so there is a lot of reflex a lot of reflex actions. It's really interesting in Taiwan, where the Minister of Digital Technologies suggested a model based on digital technologies of interactions between different citizens to come up with the best solutions to the problems of society. So there was an algorithm which tried to hone in on common elements between the different citizens, not the elements that divided them. And it worked quite well. So I think looking for funding and regulation to make sure that AI goes in that direction. But when we're talking about global public goods, we think about the climate, health, biodiversity, poverty. We don't necessarily think about that other thing, about new digital technologies. And just to wrap up, the same applies to security. That's a new challenge. It's hardly a surprise to me to know that Luxembourg's Prime Minister, which is right next to Saarland, where I live, that a Canadian Prime Minister said we should create a new institution to finance common defence investments. This is almost a conversation between the French and the German. And let's recognise this. For the time being, even between France and Germany, we are not mobilising the necessary synergy to take us forward on what would be a fabulous project. Perhaps Odile Françoise Renaud-Bassot would like to react. So, this suggestion of a smaller institution between Europe, Canada and other countries to extend funding. So common good could be artificial intelligence, defence, why not? There's more money being channeled into defence than the climate right now, so there is some arbitration which needs to take place. To come back on digital technologies, because BRD is already investing in that field, are we not lagging too far behind? Well, the new stakes, digital technologies, defence, etc., but the new world we're living in and the new challenges we're facing mean that we have to take a fresh look at how we're investing. Cybersecurity, for example. When you're doing any infrastructure project, you immediately have to address the question of cybersecurity. When you're working in the field of energy or renewables, you have to find out whether the supplier has what kind of control do you have over the data, how stable is the system. These were questions which were just not in our mindset. But now we have to include that in the advice that we can give to countries. Say, be careful in such and such a, or to businesses as well. We have to advise them on how they can protect themselves in terms of cybersecurity. For a country, how they can manage this question of dependency. We saw that with COVID and the consequences of the wars in the Ukraine and the Middle East, these questions of dependency and having production infrastructures which depend too heavily on other countries. So economic development strategies, or if I may butt in, with the Iran war, we realize how very dependent Europe is. Yeah, it takes time. Europe has developed some alternative production infrastructures, but yes, it's a heavily fragmented and very conflictual world today. And there are a lot of risks. So we really have to reflect on this and build this into development strategies, including questions of local production, so that we can enhance the value chain and be less dependent. We can produce added value locally. The second chapter, which is also very important, if you want to talk about the absence of subsidies is that you have to work with the private sector. So our mandate is to work mainly with private investors, not to fund states or the public sector, but to work with private projects and help them. And that is one way of funding development through private investment. One of the big challenges for development banks today, as Grégoire said, is that we have our balance sheet, we levy funds, we can take out loans, we've got strong financial foundations, but we are not on a level with the financing needs to cope with the climate change or the development of developing countries. So we have to combine private investments with our own investments. We work, for example, with fund managers and pension funds here in Europe, in the Netherlands, for example. We have these funds which are interested in allocating some of their investments to projects in emerging countries because there will be impact there. That will contribute socially, or there will be an impact on the climate, which satisfies the needs of the retired, for example, who want to have that impact. They are not going to take big risks. It's a small part of their investments, but it can really make a difference. So we work very much to try and develop mechanisms with the private actors, with insurance companies as well, which are trying to enhance their yield. And they too can work with us to fund, to have a lever effect of our own investments, to attract private investors. And I believe that this is a path which we will take increasingly in the future to fund these countries.
So private companies, you mean, right? Grégoire, Chevrière-Le Drian, we need to be more creative. Is that what this is about? We feel like the arm of strength is going to be the European Union. There are differences between France and Germany and all that. It's not that simple, and Spain as well. How do we ramp it up? How do we scale up on AI? It's interesting to notice that a number of European financing turn to the US, the NASDAQ. So there's a whole part of the European savings that are being invested in the US. And this money is leaving the continent for the US. How do we face this type of reaction to the geopolitical context? Well, my comment, and I want to react to what Odile was explaining, the Draghi report that 800 billion of financing needs per year. The European Bank for Reconstruction is the European Investment Bank as well. So the money cannot all be found in the public powers, so we have to turn to strategic investment partners. Our role as public institution is to advance things, to work as a catalytic power. We try to gather the banks, investment funds, to have a synergy that is led by the public policy, but we also embark the private sector, even if we're going to take the first part of the risk to kind of de-risk an investment that is going to be made. These strategic choices and these strategic projects can be topics that are very structuring for Europe. I have in mind, electric batteries, for example. When Europe decides to get out of the thermal engine by 2030 and to just break away from have to import some oil, the idea is not to be dependent on another commodity, is to promote the emergence of actors who are going to offer a real European option on the European ground of electric batteries, for example. It needs time, of course, to build the industry, and it's risky. So Northvolt, that we supported from the beginning, it's not a success story. Second example, Vercors in France, the demonstrator in Grenoble with the financing in 2020, and another project in Duncan Dunkerque that we supported on huge amounts. We're talking about 200 billion euros. So our role with other actors, particularly private actors, is to try to regroup this savings that you mentioned that is invested massively on the American market rather than in Europe, and to create favorable conditions to mobilize those funds. We do it on an everyday basis on the projects that we finance. We do it with some tools that are innovative. This is innovative finance, like a European Champion Initiative. With that initiative, we're trying to promotes the emergence of investment funds that have a goal to reach over €1 billion. So we can invest 200, 300 million euros as a partner to make sure that this fund can invest in, rounds of tables of several million euros. Before we didn't have enough of a market in Europe, and those companies were finding funders in other markets. So our role is to find those funds with a political orientation, with a political governance, and to earmark them to the priorities of Europe, which is first fighting against climate change. That we're going to keep that, and of course, over 60% of our activity, and France is the first to benefit from it, from this segment. Second is innovation that we invest on. There won't be any peace if we don't promote jobs, and there's another sector that you mentioned, which came on top of the other ones in terms of priority, is defense and security. This was a segment that we didn't take into account, like alcohol or pornography, by some investors. Today, now, Europe is no longer naive, so we multiply by 4 our investments in defense sector. And that operation, like we did with Airbus for 3 billion euros, Thales last year, and smaller companies, we don't do it on our own. We do it together with banks, because they borrow money from us to loan even 3 or 4 times more, because the EIB is quite fragmented and through funds, some companies or equity funds, they can have access to European funding with some good resources. Paulo Correa, what are the tools that you use, the Inter-American Development Bank, to finance? You mentioned poverty. That remains a very important topic that requires a lot of funds, but maybe with a special method, more innovative methods and tools. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you very much. I think this is essentially one of the important messages. There are a lot of priorities right now here for Europe. And I wanted to bring this one from the perspective of the Global South, if you want. And there is a recent study from Berkeley University saying that to eliminate extreme poverty in the world requires 0.3% of the global GDP. So it's affordable, number one. Number two, I want you to think for a moment what it means to live without $2.15 a day. I don't know how much is gum or a glass of water. It's $2.15 a day. I had the chance to work not only in Brazil, of course, but in Mozambique, Madagascar, some very poor countries in Africa. And this is the difference from eating or not eating 1 meal a day or less, eating from trash. I don't want to be dramatic, but I do want to appeal to your sense of priorities among several other very important that exist here, I'm sure, and I do relate to those. Now, why we think this is possible? It's not only financially viable. I think we know what to do, we know how to do, and why to do. And one of the main examples are the conditional cash transfers, or the cash transfers that exist in part of the world, including in Brazil. The program is called Bolsa Família. It gives resources to extreme poor families, conditioned to keeping kids at school, keeping kids vaccinated, and currently it attends 20.8 million people. It's affordable. It has resulted in people living out of extreme poverty, better attendance rates at school, lower mortality rates, intergenerational mobility, which is very important. We've been hearing here past days the importance of having hope in the future. Imagine what is this about in Latin America, and all the impact on populism and all these things that we don't like. necessarily. And finally, the impact on crime. And this is all documented by rigorous academic studies. And now why financial external aid is so important? Because it happens that in countries that are most in need, like Madagascar and Mozambique, there are just too many extreme poor for too little GDP. So in other words, the program doesn't fit in the budget, doesn't fit in the overall economy of those countries. So that implies that we will need for a while some external financing for such types of programs, number one. And number two, you're going to need technical assistance to help shape these programs to the reality of those countries, fitting it in the technicalities. One final example, 30% of people in Mozambique don't have IDs, so they legally don't exist. So you cannot start any social program like that. So it will take time, it will require technical assistance. IDB only works for Latin America and the Caribbean, but we were planning to have such a type of intervention in Haiti, which is more or less our equivalent. So again, I know this is a little bit orthogonal with other issues that we have been addressing here, but from a development perspective and from a perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean, I wanted to bring this into the table.
Et cette aide locale conditionnelle a fonctionné au Brésil.
And this conditional help functioned in Brazil, didn't it?
Est-ce que vous voulez peut-être...
Pierre Jacquet, do you want to briefly conclude, wrap up so we can leave 5 minutes to take the questions from the room? Yes, thank you. I would like to note a number of things. First of all, a paradox, which is that we mentioned this geopolitical dynamic that leads to a fragmented world, and at the same time there's a need for collective action that was never so urgent with changing the public goods, the common public goods. So this encompasses climate, security, fighting against international crime, health as well, with the pandemics that came out as a collective common good and not only national common good, information that is international as well, management, new challenges and opportunities led by AI, raised by AI. So we have this tension that is rather good news because it means, so you're optimistic, yes, because this geopolitical dynamic that is breaking up is not compatible with this need for common action. So it means that we're going to be forced to find a solution. And this solution is going to be to build some coalitions around common goals. The clubs that Jacob was mentioning, and I think that's fundamental. The second idea is to mobilize the private sector and to make a link with a previous theme. It shouldn't be clubs of states. It should be clubs of actors, private and public, gather around common goals. The problem was mobilizing the public sector is the numbers, isn't it? It's like trillions, billions, and well, the private sector has its own logic, and it's only going to invest in a project if it's profitable. So we have to build coalitions around particular goals. How can we fight against climate change? How can we reduce poverty? How can we, by associating the private sector from the beginning, from the design phase? And if we do it that way, we can do a lot of things, and I think it's a fundamental approach. The third message is the balance between rupture and continuity. We feel that we're in a world of disruption, but yet we've built these institutions that play a major role. So what we've heard around this table is the fact that we have institutions that are in charge with instruments that have proven to work, and now we need to put political will behind that to gather all these strengths. And what we're lacking in this club philosophy is the capacity to work together. And the problem of having institutions is it creates a form of institutional logic, and it creates competition among those institutions. So how can we go beyond that and create common actions around common goals? Let's ask the room if they have questions. Any questions in the room? Yes, gentlemen. Maybe somebody's going to bring you a mic. Thank you. I have a question for investments of the European Bank. on the funding defense. My first question is, are those investments from the European Bank, are they taken into account when we calculate the GDP? So the countries, the percentage of the GDP that the countries allocate to their defense, and is it the same breakdown among each countries, or some countries are privileged, like, for example, the Baltic states? Who was to answer? Grégoire. We don't give the priority to any country. There's a request that it's not the same, and the industrial basis is not the same either. It's different throughout Europe. We need to answer the requests and the markets without giving and spoiling any secrets. The two countries that benefit the most for the European Bank are Poland and France, with a very dynamic private market. In terms of counting, based on the GDP, we think, however, on how to calculate it within the commitment of the country to NATO. The mechanism is a bit more complex in the tools that I mentioned early on mobilizing the private sector. We like to think about creating a fund, a defense equity facility, in which we try to attract the public and private sector. And the share that would be paid by the public sector would be counted within that commitment from the GDP. Another question? And the commitment to NATO, sorry. Gentlemen out there, I have a question on defense. There's a NATO investment fund to invest on startups that create defense equipment. Maybe you can do something like this, like for the climate or other goals that you've defined and identified. Grégoire, again, we try to invest. We're aware that we need to invest in defense and tech at the same time. We want to reconcile innovation and defense. When we talk about technology, we don't always talk about mature companies. We're looking at early stage. We have funds who do it with venture investment. But there's also a fund from the European Commission that enlarged its investment scope to defense. It's called EIC, European Independent Council, who has two tools, one up to 4 million euros of subsidies and one in private equity that can go up to 30 million euros. It was enlarged recently by what we call the STEP program. I'm sorry for all these acronyms. And they can give up to 30 million, and that number could be even increased to 50 or 70 million euros, which is a game changer versus the European Commission, which hadn't made any investment in equity recently at all. And we see this ambition to be there for early stage companies and defense. Last question, Mr. Minister, you on the floor. It's a very important question, and Europe can play a major role there, but we need to really have a common reflection among the member states. I'm talking about my own country. We're increasing the defense budget and the spending by 50 to 150 billion per year. And at the moment in the US, they spend 10 or 12% of the military spending on technology. In Germany, it's rather 2%. In France, I don't know the number. But if you look around European countries, there's a very direct link between the traditional suppliers of weapons and the government. So technology is not enough invested in. So if the member states don't start to think about it, could they ramp up on their percentage to towards 10%? In technology, Europe by itself is not going to manage to change that mindset, which is important for security and to avoid a waste of resources that is not going to help our economy. So it's very important, the point that you're making. Europe can make things happen. But without the member states' political will, we won't get anywhere. So, Grégoire, Paolo, Odile, Jacob, thank you all. Thank you for being with us. And we continue on a different topic. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So one controversy which we're interested in today is how we can finance the French industry rebound. For several years we've been talking about industrial sovereignty, ecological transitions, rearming the economy. Europe has a lot of reports. There was the L'État and the Draghi reports recommending 800 billion euros per year to make up for our industrial lagging. Yet Europe is not poor. Welcome to you. With us we also have a representative of business, Xavier Gier, who is General Manager of Suez. You worked at the Cour des Comptes before you worked for TDA. Then you were a financial director of the Post Office and then EDF, the electricity board here, and then you have become boss of Suez for the last year. Hello, everybody. So I wanted to start by carrying out a diagnosis. Mr. Moulin, you are the new governor of the Banque de France. You've only been in your position for a month. Your previous roles were political in the French government. So how is it that we're so good at making reports but so bad at actually implementing them? Well, thank you, Caroline. I think that Europe doesn't only write reports. So I'm going to start with a nice story. I think we're going to have half an hour moaning and groaning about the situation in Europe. But I'm going to start off on a positive note. There's a tiny miracle which happens 40 kilometers from here at a place called Fos-sur-Mer. For the very first time for 50 years, we are going to be reopening a steelwork. A steelwork with an electric furnace. It's low carbon footprint. It has been implemented by an Italian group, which is a family firm. It is funded by energy saving certificates, 600 million. It was boosted by the French government, of course, and I believe that we do have opportunities today to re-industrialize and finance the re-industrialization if we are a bit inventive in the way we use finance at our disposal. So yes, we can finance this industrial rebound, and I'll give you some concrete examples of what we can do in this local area here in the south of France. So as a central banker, we are not directly financing industry. The environment is favorable with its low interest rates, not going too low because we need to remain credible given the inflation. And the third little point which I would like to make is that we mustn't only put blinkers on and only looking at industry. There are many other things in the service sector and in real estate, such as data centers, which need to be funded also, so that industry can flourish in Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Moulin, for that lovely story. So data centers will be cropping up later on when we talk to Mr. Gier, I believe, because that's something important for you, for water. Let's not forget that we have an advantage here in France. We have low carbon energy. That's one of the reasons why SoftBank recently at the Choose France Summit selected to invest in France 75 billion euros for data centers. So, Monsieur Giret, in France, is there not also a problem of adapting infrastructures and modernizing infrastructures? I think in France we have a strong point. First and foremost, we've got infrastructures which are of good quality in all sectors, in the rail sector, in roads, energy, water, telecommunications. In all fields we've developed our infrastructures. We could give you a whole bunch of figures, but all in all, we are really well equipped here in France. On the other hand, the subject we're facing today is that most of these infrastructures were developed in the second half of the 20th century. So today they're rather decrepit. They're all a bit decrepit. Whether we're talking about railway tracks, roads, The water network, which is losing about 20% of water on average. These infrastructures really need to be renewed and revamped. And we're doing it, but far too slowly. For the water network, the renewal rate is 0.68% per year, so we need 500 years to renew the system. But we haven't got that time. We can't waste all of that time. It's true also in energy. You reminded that I was financial director of the French Electricity Board up until quite recently. Today, we are relying on nuclear energy since the 70s, 80s, 90s. So there is a big challenge there to renew our facilities. We've got the EPR2 program, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that as well. So today we need to invest heavily, tens of billions of euros to renew these infrastructures. Another figure for water, we invest about 6.5 billion euros per year here in France in the networks. We're going to have to increase that sum by 50% and invest 3 further billion per year. So the infrastructure is aging, and also it's not adapted to these new transitional challenges. We've got digital and energy transitions to think of. So we need to invest heavily there. We all know, and we see here how we're exposed to extreme weather conditions, that water is lacking. We have new water needs. We need to use wastewater. We do that to 20% here in France, 10% in Spain. We have to do desalination, so there's a lot of possibilities. We haven't got any desalination factories here in France. Suez has got the technology, tried and trusted for about 10 years ago. But desalination is going to be an increasing challenge. And also there's a question of the quality of water, which will require extra investment. So there's 3 or 4 extra billion per year going to have to be invested to face these environmental transition challenges. And we've got the digital transition as well. You mentioned data centers already. That is a huge challenge. France already has leapt up there, and we've got quite a few data centers already. But the program is going to speed up. We know that RTE has got is preparing to connect future data centers. We're going to have to develop energy infrastructures to cater for all of this increased energy needs. We're going to have to also control our water consumption as well. We need some closed circuits so that water can be reused. So this really is a crucial time. Today we're living on infrastructures which were developed by our parents and grandparents, and if we don't all together roll up our sleeves to tend to the situation, then we are going to bequeath to our children and grandchildren an extra debt in terms of water and infrastructures. These infrastructures are so key to industry, but they are industries in themselves also. We have industrial groups of all shapes and sizes, huge ones like Suez and Orange, and public enterprises as well. SNCF, to mention just one, the railways. We need to support these infrastructures, which means you are supporting the industrial heart of France. Thank you very much, Gilles. So this is a key point in time, Mr. Moulin. You are now at the head of the Banque de France at this key moment in time. Let me give you some figures about savings. Europe has got savings. Fourth quarter of 2025, European households save 1.4 billion, which is 600 billion more than the Draghi report suggests per year. We've got 35 billion savings in Europe, and in France we've got a savings rate which is one of the highest in Europe, 17%, 12 in Spain, 11 in Italy. Those are the percentages which come from the Federation of French Banks. So we're not really talking about the union of capital markets, we're talking about the union of savings for investment. What is this? Is this a new mirage? Is this something we're going to see, this thing? And what's holding things up? No, it's not a mirage. This is something which was launched in 2015. Yes, we're taking our time. I think we have sped up recently. You are right in saying that we do have a lot of savings in Europe. 35,000 million, that's 35 trillion. So these savings, about 1/4 of them are in cash and accounts. So you put your savings on your bank account or on savings tools which don't really generate a lot of interest. So in Europe, industry is funded by the banking sector mainly, which is all well and good. Our banking sector is strong and very resilient. However, when you lend, you want to get reimbursed the same amount as you're lending. When you're an investor, however, you want to earn money and you're prepared to take risks. That's the difference between personal cash and bank funding. We can finance growth. And that's the tricky thing today. Here at our investment banks, we need to encourage Europeans to invest in a way which will encourage investment and cover risk. We can only do that if we have a long-term perspective. And from that point of view, we need to develop pension funds, capitalization funds, savings via capitalization such as pensions. In Europe, we've got an example which works very well. In the Netherlands and in Sweden, there are some huge capitalization funds which have developed a whole ecosystem with a stock exchange which is very active and works well with startups. So what we want to reproduce in Europe, that's what we want to do. There are several ways of going about this. There are 4 pillars, in fact. First of all, you've got the 28th regime, which is simplified to create businesses.
Then we have the development of saving products by capitalization. I want to give the example of Germany. This is incredible. In Germany, there's a consensus between the socialists, which are the power, and the right wing, the SPD, which is the equivalent of the French Socialist Party, and the right-wing party, which is the center or the Republican in France, that agree together to increase the age of retirement to 67 years and to create some capitalization funds. That's a great example for the French because there's no doom and gloom for us to go against a topic such as aging and retirement. Everybody knows and understands the facts. So this is an example that we should follow and own and feel like maybe in the next presidential campaign coming up, it's a topic that we should really deal with. And the third pillar is the issuance of securities. We're afraid that we're going to go back to the subprime crisis. It's not at all what we want to do. We want to issue some securities in a very secure way, and to also free up the capacity to take loans. So we want to do some credits to small SMEs, credits that are not too risky. We want to have a secure securitization. And we also need a European supervision because today, if you want to do an IPO, if you want to grow your company and go look for capital on the market, on the stock market, you have to face 27 regulations, 27 national authorities. So it's really important to have a supervision that you can only deal with one entity when you want to raise funds. A lot of examples, a lot of solutions for this to finance this rebound. Monsieur Moulin, you had an example, is the financing of nuclear. You worked a lot on that with EDF, and there are things that are moving along. Yeah, each case is different, but I think that was done to fund the new EPR2, the new French nuclear program, is a beautiful work. It's a collective work that has been with Éric Lombard, who's with us, who contributed, Olivier Sichel as well. There's many of us who contributed to this project, and for myself, I was a CFO of EDF at the time. What was the idea supporting this project was to mobilize the savings of the French, managed by the Caisse de dépôt, was 50 billion euros. And this is just a small part of this savings. 50 billion approximately to get a loan, a long-term loan from EDF to finance this investment that is at 73 million euros, sorry, which is enough for our national electric grid. The state brings a bonification of this loan, so EDF can has a 0% interest rate, and eventually a 3% interest rate at the end. So it limits the public spending, which is very important because when we know the situation of the public debt today, and beyond that funding framework, it's a regulation framework which allows us to really manage once the reactors are built, to give visibility to EDF, which will be the operator of those reactors, on their compensation and to secure the financing. So it's really a flagship of what can be done for those great structures for the country, because the role of everyone is very well defined. The industry leaders commit over a long period of time. The state commits as well with a guarantee, by bringing a guarantee. The savings of the households is mobilized, and that sets a framework that can invest in major infrastructures to develop industry in our country. Monsieur Moulin, you are governor of the Banque de France. We had a first decision that was to fund something for what is required for funding. You made the decision. Well, we have interest rates that are very low at the moment. We are 2.25. If you compare around us, we are at levels that are still very low. We made a decision to raise the interest rate by 25 base points because we have an inflation situation, and if we want to avoid getting ahead of ourselves and we want to avoid for inflation to spread. So we made a decision that was legitimate in all the scenarios that we looked at. But we also said in our communication that we're not committing into a new cycle, a bullish cycle of interest rates. So we're in a good position today, considering the elements that we have on inflation. And I believe that it was a decision that was important and significant, but that allows us today to look at the future with more trust, in a more optimistic way. We're not in forward guidance, so I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do in July. Would it be a mistake to increase the rates in July? I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do, because we'll make that decision based on the data that we have at the moment. What is true is that the drop of the oil price comforts us in our position today on interest rates. So we are in a situation where we will be able to fund growth and investment. I wanted just to say a word on this tool that is called Livret A, which is a saving tool for French people. So I'm going to talk to the minister about the rates applied for this Livret A. There may be a bit of a small increase on the rates for that one. It's a bit of a French miracle, this Livret A. You know, we don't have oil, but we have a lot of good ideas. 400 billion of savings into those Livret A, and it's very well used by the Caisse de dépôt. It's used to finance social housing, to finance investment in water, and we decided that we're going to use the resource of the Livret A to fund a new nuclear sector. So what is great about this pool of funds, of savings, is that it's liquid. You can take it back if you want, but it's very stable. So we can fund over long-term horizons, so 20 years, 30 years, the new nuclear. So transform a liquid savings into long-term investments for the benefit of the country and for the benefit of the industry. because one of our benefits is to have a price of electricity that is 35% cheaper than our competitor, and low carbon energy. So this is an advantage that we need to keep. We could have talked about many other things, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I would like Mr. Givre and you, Mr. Moulin, to each taking turns, so you make us all both an economic proposal for this presidential campaign to try to fund this industrial rebound. I'll give you two proposals. One is that the state works on long-term horizons, particularly on infrastructures, and also I'm thinking about the channels of water. Water is managed locally, and it's very good this way, but the appreciation of the needs in water, quality and health of the water is a national challenge. So that should be a commitment for the state. Second message is, as much as possible, to provide stability and predictability, because for companies and for investors, it's very important to be able to see things in a long time horizon, because this way you can judge on your return on investment. So stability in taxes and budget would be very good. Monsieur Moulin, I would like to say that let's not wait for the elections. In 2027, there'll be some elections in France, in Spain, in Italy. So there'll be many elections in 2027. And we're only in July 2026. We have time ahead of us, so we need to act now. We need to accelerate on savings to make progress there, and to have a text of law on securitization. And I think we can also work on common debt as a way to finance new projects versus its funding in quantum and AI. Those investments are badly needed, and we have very few reliable assets at the European level. Americans have 35 trillions in their treasury. We have very little. We have 1 trillion maybe of common debt within Europe. So I think it's a tool that we need to use, and that will reduce our borrowing costs, and that will be very useful to finance the industrial rebound. And we have to look at it at the European level. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session number 47. We're heading towards the end of the series of conferences. Restoring the reliability of information. How can we determine what's true and what's not in a world where artificial intelligence is amplifying the production of fake news and broadcasting it massively through the social networks? How can we reestablish trust between public opinion and the media in this polarized world where social networks are amplifying bubbles? And what can we do about the domination of big tech and the concentration of media in a few hands? How can we resist foreign interference, particularly during elections? These are the different subjects which we're going to try and broach this morning with panelists who have been carefully chosen by the Cercle des Économistes to bring us a maximum amount of information on this score. You all know Anne Perrault. She's a member of the Cercle, and she'll be saying a few words in a minute. Next to her, we have Vanessa Berggraf, who works for France 24. Maya Mazurkiewicz is co-founder of an NGO called Alliance for Europe, and she's going to be speaking in English later on. Philippe Caduc, the chair of ADIT, he's going to talk about influence and communication. Etienne Grasse, who is Global Chief AI Officer at Capgemini. And finally, Didier Quillou, who is the chair of Cities Media. So, to sketch out the parameters of our discussion, we're going to hear from Anne Perrault. She's got a few minutes just to shed some light. Thank you very much, Philippe. So, why are we addressing this question? Why are we under the impression that the reliability of information is endangered? I think there are two main causes which are connected, of course. The first is the spectacular degradation of media model, TV, the newspapers and everything, because if we take a look over the past 10 years, we have digital technologies arrive, and that drew audiences towards free content, to those websites where you can read 3 lines of an article without actually having to subscribe or to purchase that newspaper. So the audience shifted massively to free access, and it's very, very superficial, I think we have to say, a superficial way of broaching the news. That was the first way of losing revenue for the media. The second source of revenue for the media is advertising. Of course, the advertisers go where the public is, where the audience is. And as the audience is heading to social networks, well, the advertisers followed them. One might say, well, that's no problem. They will go online to see what they used to be reading on paper. However, the platforms where these medias are accessible, Google and Facebook, for example, have got very high market power in advertising intermediation, all of those technologies that you need to use to get the right ad in front of the right person at the right time, because advertising on internet can be targeted. So that's all being monopolized by Facebook and Google. And so when an investor invests in an advertising campaign online, well, Google and Facebook collect a huge amount of that revenue, and it no longer tumbles into the pocket of the media. That, of course, has created a twofold loss of revenue for the media. However, the production of reliable news, which has been authenticated and checked in all possible ways, has a cost. That cost has been assessed as 3 billion euros for 2024. That was a study that was carried out by ARCOM and the Minister for Culture. So 35% for TV, 28% for written press. So there's a loss of revenue with costs which remain high, and on top of that, there's a fragmentation of your audience. Who produces news or so-called news today? Well, we have traditional media, we have new media. Some of them are totally honorable and reliable, and they do proper journalistic work. But there are also tens, hundreds, thousands of influencers who draw attention, because we know that's what people are battling it out for, to try and attract people and call their attention. And so a lot of their news is never checked. So the cost is 2.9 million euros that I was talking about, this 3 billion that I'm talking about, is corresponds to reliable information. In parallel with this movement, this loss of revenue, losing their revenue and their audience, for reasons linked to digital technologies, but different channels, of course. Facebook, of course, is a giant. But there's a lot of fragmentation and dispersion of the audiences and of demand, and that is damaging to the reliability of news, because there are all these algorithms which are used on the different platforms and social networks. And so emotional content is always the biggest draw for audiences over rational news which has been checked. It's not really very interesting to check whether or not a figure that is published is right or wrong. So the algorithms that impact the reliability of internet, the capacity of drawing in huge crowds, well, that has destroyed the reliability of the news and information. So there are some medias who are faring very, very badly. They can be purchased by industrial groups. One might think it's a good thing, because at least they're not vanishing off the face of the earth. But those industrial groups don't necessarily pursue the same goals as traditional media. They may, for example, want to serve their own industry, or they might be on some ideological crusade. And so we see that this concentration of media in the hands of industrial groups is a factor which undermines the reliability of the news. So there are some solutions for all of these problems, but these are problems that have been broached incorrectly by the General Meeting of Information. That was a project launched in 2023 here in France. There was a big meeting and a report drawn up on these different topics. A lot of proposals were put forward in these meetings, but for the time being, absolutely nothing has happened. Hopefully something will happen. Thank you very much, Anne, for describing the topic that we're going to be talking about. The figures which you have given shed a lot of light. I've forgotten to say who I am. I, for a long time, was a journalist and then editorial manager of La Tribune. Now I'm an independent journalist. I'm no longer working for La Tribune. So you might think that it's not an oxymoron, which is why I'm here on the stage here as a journalist, an independent journalist. And the subject of independence, Vanessa, because you're the first person to speak, when you are a journalist in today's situation, I'd like you to shed some light on how you experience this at France 24. I could make an observation to begin with. Everyone is more aware today, the citizens are aware of this war of news. In the arena of news, you've got state players such as Russia and China and Turkey, whose position is one of attack. They are attacking our media every day. France 24, France 24's journalists, we've got 4 news channels broadcast 24/7 in French, in English, in Arabic, and in Spanish. We are broadcast all over the world, and our journalists are attacked every day. You may wonder how they're attacked. Well, our identity is usurped. Very recently, when there was the death of Alain Ouattara, that was announced on a post which was then posted throughout social networks with the France 24 logo on it. It was fake news, but it went viral. 100,000 views. We had to debunk it. Artificial intelligence, I'm sure we're going to be talking about that as well. Here again, we are on the front line because our newspapers and the voices of our presenters are being kidnapped via artificial intelligence. So they get our news presenters speaking fake news thanks to digital technologies. So there was a visit planned to Kiev which had been cancelled apparently, but it was a whole bunch of lies. So why are we under attack? Well, it's important to note that France, and this was shown in a report published recently, France is the second most targeted country by foreign interference and by fake news. And when your channel is called France 24, you've got the word France in there. And we're part of a group which is called France Media World. There's France 24, there's Radio France, there's International Radio France. Well, our products and our journalists are targeted because we have a huge impact today in areas where we have a big audience in French-speaking Africa, for example, but also in the Arab-speaking world, in the Maghreb. France 24 is the leading international news channel in French-speaking Africa and the second international channel in Arabic language in the Maghreb. So there's an attempt to create mistrust and confusion, to undermine our media and to discredit our output. So it's not a question of, well, it's not combating fake news only, although that is very important. It's really important to protect a good which is common to us all, reliable, independent, checked, pluralistic news and information. And I think a big rampart against fake news is the way in which we deliver information and news. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Maya Mazokiewicz, I'm going to hand you the floor right now about these threats which are hanging over with foreign interference. Perhaps you could tell me who your NGO is, Alliance for Europe, and what you are noting. Do you notice an intensification? You're Polish, so you're very familiar with the situation in Europe. There are going to be elections also in Poland, before the French ones, in fact.
After the French ones, we are in October 2027.
After, okay.
But yeah, indeed, it's a pleasure to be in here and to talk about such an important topic because indeed Poland and France, I believe, we are very much targeted, especially by Russia. But Russia is not the only state actor and not the only actor that is working with the influence operations, because I would say first that the issue is much bigger than we usually think. We need to get back and think of our information space. And the information space that we are getting right now is very messy. It's full of chaos. It's full of influence operations that are targeting our minds and our hearts. And that's a battle and a war where we are on. And every second poll, according to the research we recently did, knows that. They are comparing the influence operations, that is disinformation, one of them, right? There are different tactics, techniques, and operations that are being put in the information space. So every second poll already is aware that its attack on our information space is similar to the threat that there is attack of the missiles and the tanks coming on our earth and our soil. And I would say those are not yet in Europe, not in the European Union. They are in Europe, in the Ukraine. But the big influence operations are already here. And we can see that they're affecting our attitudes, our minds, and our emotions. Also the way how we feel. And I'm just going to bring it a bit to the diet. I think that we are all aware that what we are eating is how we are feeling as humans. But are we really aware that what kind of information are we consuming? It's making the way how we feel, what we believe in, and how we form our opinions. And that refers as well to the elections. So electoral campaigns, and I think we're going to be talking about a bit later, they are hugely influenced. And Alliance for Europe is an organization that I co-founded back in 2017, 2018, so right before the European elections. And we've been already seeing what is happening in terms of the influence operations and disinformation. The first times that we saw it on the large scale was when Ukraine was attacked at the very first time. So back in 2014, 2013, Ukraine was already calling that there is not only the military attack of Russia into their soil, but also the attack on their citizens. And it's ongoing. And it's very much strengthened in comparison to what was happening before. But that's why we need to come together and really decide what we are doing. Because right now it's not only Russia that is attacking us, but it's also the algorithms, as you said, of the platforms that are amplifying the information and emotions. The main emotions that we are in, starting from the pandemic, is fear. So imagine, for the past 6 years, most of our societies is in fear. And I think that was already spoken by your Prime Minister in the first day, but that's exactly the thing. If we are in fear, we are coming into the tunnel thinking. We are not really looking for different informations. And the goal of it is to polarize the societies. And I think we can see that both of our societies are much more polarized than we are. And the goal is to bring the chaos and less trust in the institutions and reliable media. And that's also already happening. But it's also about changing the attitudes. And maybe some of you is aware of our diplomatic impasse that happened between Poland and Ukraine as well recently. And we are seeing that that is also in comparison to what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. Like, if we are trying to finish the war that is happening in there are different forces that are trying to influence people. And what is happening in Poland, Polish society will not be, and it's not in favor of Russia, but what Russia's influence operations are doing, they're changing the attitudes of Poles toward the Ukrainian refugees. And I think what is important, we need to change the way how we communicate. It's not only about fact-checking, it's not only about talking of how media should be more visible, but it's also about strategic communication and amplifying some of the news that, for example, Russia wants to bring them in on the first pages of media. That's a big problem. So just one more thing. What I believe that we need to do, we need a societal agreement on the internet. We've never been discussing about how internet should look like and the space that we are living right now, and we need a safety of the space.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup pour
Thank you very much. Your words resonate to our ears. Philippe Caduc, I think that what would be interesting in preparing this debate for you, who your group is at the heart of these strategic international questions, and the question of information, reliability of fact, of course, matters to you. Could you give us a bit of an historical background, because those topics of disinformation and manipulation go back a long time? Yes. The wrong information, the fake information, has always been a political lever, and information has always been at the heart of the political battleground. Ramses II fought the Battle of Kadesh in Syria, and he nearly lost the battle, and he was betrayed by the intelligence of the tribes at the time. However, he went back to Egypt, Alexandria, and he had engraved on the walls of 5 temples the story of a beautiful victory. We see him alone, on his battling and winning over the enemies. But having said that, he was defeated in the battle because his military intelligence failed. But yet he entered legend on a very bold strategy of pure communication. Just to remind you, the last words of the film, The Man Who Killed Liberty Valance, when legend goes beyond reality, you got to print out the legend. History, of course, is full of these deep fakes, And I just wanted to quote Octavio, who read at the Senate the so-called will of Marc-Antoine, in which he was typically giving away the Roman territories to Cleopatra. It was another fake news that led to the end of the Roman Republic, actually, and created the suicidal of Cleopatra and ended 3,000 of domination of the pharaohs. So it's the biggest deep fakes of history. So many other examples. I'd like to mention this major deep fake of the Tsar policy on the Protocol of Sion. It's still spreading throughout continents. And there were still people referring to this protocol of the wise men of science. So it's been always part of our history. A lie that is repeated 1,000 times turns into truth, and you can quote us also the photographies of the officials, the Soviet officials. And our patriotic stories, would tell us that the German bullets will not get across our uniforms to bolster the troops. So everything has been, highlighted to show how the power shapes and has always shaped collective narratives. And Ellul took it one step further and said propaganda is not just up for the dictators or the winners. It's used. There's this sociological propaganda that is very insidious and that penetrates in everybody's reality, and he demonstrates that manipulation that is not only based on one fact. It could go anywhere. So just to say that disinformation is an old phenomenon. What characterized our modern times is that it's scaling up. There's a different scale to it, with a speed of propagation that is much faster, which makes it all much more difficult, and that makes it even more difficult to make a difference between the true and the false. Yes, thank you first of all, for this historic vision, which is very interesting, which took us back in the depths of history and also allows us to look at the future. We can also quote George Orwell, who said something that said, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present. And you know it in 1984. There's a sentence that is not from Orwell, but that is saying the truth is a revolutionary act. That would be a good way to complement your debate. And I would also like to tell you the other quotation from Orwell: liberty is to say that 2 and 2 make 4 if all the rest aligns. It's a good segue to give the floor to Etienne Grasse, because thanks to AI, we're entering a world of massification of the good, but potentially the evil. And can you please tell us all those models that we use frequently? We all know them. We don't need to name them. Aren't they a source of manipulation today? Thank you, Philippe. I like to say that telling the truth is a revolutionary act. I'd also like to tell you a story. 12th of July, 1989, when we called the Parisians to fight. 1889, sorry. You only remember one out of all these Parisians, is Camille Desmoulins. Why do you remember only this man? Because he's at the Palais Royal, which is near a tree, which we call the Krakow tree, where everybody were going around to spread information. That's where fake news were circulating in Paris. And he's the one it's Camille Desmoulins who called Paris to the arms. So sometimes you have to be at the center of information to be able to spread it. I wrote a little text this morning, and I'd like to show you how things have been changing in the last 2 or 3 years with ChatGPT. I downloaded DeepSeek, and I asked the Chinese model, I asked them what he thought of the Tiananmen events, for example. He answered that he didn't have enough information to answer me. I asked them what do they feel about the Devaquet law and all the protests that raised it. He produced a 3-page report. Very well. So the language models are a vision, give us a vision of the world. If you ask Anthropic, Claude, are the rich, do they deserve their salary? They will say not at all, and the other one will say yes. So Claude is woke. Is that what you say? Claude is woke. Is Claude woke? That's a good topic. When you do the world value survey, there's many economists in the room, and you show them language models, they answer differently, because language models, it's like a coffee machine. There's water that goes through it. Water is the language that goes through the internet. It's the same. The filter above it, you can change it, and you can do whatever, put whatever filter you want. The people who produce this filter, they produce different types of coffee. If you're not, if you don't really clear about what you want in terms of coffee, you have a very significant bias that in your interaction with those models. So you need transparency on this bias. And this has turned into a key subject. And I think Anne was referring to the general state of information. The European AI does not deal with that. It deals with a dangerous form of manipulation, but not on the transparency, on the implicit manipulation of the language model. Some people say they create bubbles of information. It's not true. It's the social media that creates bubbles of information. The language model have, on the contrary, a tendency to break those bubbles of information. Very good study in Science last year that says that language model, they're actually very good at breaking fake news. They're excellent at convincing. If you ask them, there's an economist, Jean-François Bonnefond, who showed it. If you ask them to convince people of the effect of global warming, of the benefits of global warming, he can move the opinion poll on it. If you ask them to convince electors, Republican electors to vote Democrats, he could move 4 points in the opinion, so he could change the result of the election. They're excellent at convincing, and you really have to take stock of that. Why? Because they have a lot of time. They have a lot of arguments, and they can make their point, and they can. It's a different level of complexity. So what I'm suggesting with this language models is thinking about the whole ecosystem of information. It's not the first time that we have an abundance of information. Particularly with those language models, you have a complex information. 45% are not going through Google, but directly to ChatGPT. They have a more richer type of information. You have to penetrate this world because this is where the media will have to play a role. If you're outside of this world, you're like everybody. We're not around the Palais Royal when Camille Desmoulins stood on his bench to convince the population to take to arms. Yes, thank you. There's a study by Terra Nova that says that 1 elector out of 6 used AI to ask which candidate to vote for. So this is interesting to have this number in mind, and clearly it's only going to get bigger, the number. But what you're saying is interesting. How do you react to this? I don't want to say it next to my neighbor, but I gave you the study on the American election. The same study exists on the 2015 election in Poland, so it's a protocol that is published by Nature. 2,000 people were being polled. They were asked if they wanted to discuss with an AI to see if their political opinion was well constructed. The opinion changed from 10 points from one elector to the next. So the impact of the result of the election is huge. And of course, not everybody accepts to converse and to share their opinion, but you have to take into account that my clients, they create virtual panels to see how they can convince consumers. If the politicians, and there's a number of them in the room, create virtual panels, they'll be even more convincing, and they'll have a capacity to create AI that is changing opinions. So we're going to go now to Didier Quillot with Cities and Media. We talked about many topics, and there's one that mentions the challenge of the economic model to produce a quality information. Is it normal to have this concentration? And we're going to move on to the second parts of the second challenge is to bring regulation tools. that we all can see. I would like to say a word after what Anne said and to start launch an alert, to do like a bit of whistleblowing and give you some numbers that are quite pessimistic. The title of the round table is to go back to the reliability of information. Reliability for me means trust, and today the trust crisis that we see in the media is a crisis of funding. When I was managing the media of the Lagardère group, the part of digital in the advertisement profit was from 3 to 4%. Today, in 2026, it's 66%. I was listening yesterday the whole debate on the energy climate transition, and somebody was saying that would be in 2030 where we're supposed to be in 2050. The Arcom said that the extra-European digital platform represents 65% of will represent 65% of publicity of advertising in France in 2030. It's a market that feeds most of the media, press, broadcast, print. So this is an historic trend that is not going to stop. I don't know if we can stop it. In any event, it doesn't seem to stop now. In the month of May 2026, the numbers of the institute that measures the advertising that is spent by the advertisers in the media, the 2026 versus 2025, the press, minus 15%, television, minus 10 or 12%, radio, same, even if it resisted a bit better, around minus 10. The only media that resists better, traditional media offline, is print. I'm lucky because I have a company, billboards and print media, that resist, because it's a communication media for the cities and the citizens and all that. We're not an editorial media. So why is this phenomenon showing up? Emerging. The extra European digital platforms, we don't need to name them, they capture three things. One, the attention of the consumers. Two, they capture the attention of the advertisers because it's easier to buy from Google Ad or Meta Ad than to order the media plan offline, and they capture most of the advertisement revenues. And that's why I'm talking about doing some whistleblowing, but there's an issue of sovereignty and democracy behind it. The foundation Jean Jaurès produced a survey with another association that we're founding member of last fall that says that in the regions of France where the local media don't exist anymore, people vote less. So it's not only the end of a social link, it's the end of a democratic act, which is to vote. So this trend, this increase that is unavoidable in terms of market shares and attention and advertisement, hence financing of the digital platforms, raises a real problem with the democracy. Democracy in itself, information in the regions, in the country. And this is something that I'm really anxious to hear what the candidates to the next presidential election will say about it. I haven't heard anything about it. And there's the general state of the information that were launched by the President of the Republic 2 years ago that produced a number of recommendations and nothing happened. However, you only had to look at the number of presidential candidates who were here in Aix-en-Provence, how the media and what the influence of the traditional media is important to them and why they're not aware of that. Maybe there is one, but it hasn't been followed up with facts in legislative texts. There's some initiatives that are starting to come up to earmark the investments. Something was said last week about earmarking investment to press, the television, all this media. Television is threatened, radio is threatened, so it's time to be aware. And when I remember the Copé-Zimmermann law for gender parity in the board, I was talking to Jean-François Copé and I was asking, why do you do this? And he said, because if we don't pass a law, nothing will happen. Well, I think in terms of earmarking investments towards the traditional media, we need to pass a law. Thank you very much for your words. I think we applied a good diagnostic. I wanted to add a word to what Didier said. You probably know it. There's not one media group in France. It's probably the same abroad that is not being restructured as we speak, sometimes in a hard way, and with an impact on production of information. Of course, we're trying to protect as much as we can those who produce information, the journalists. There's some savings to be made here and there probably, but look at most media groups of France are today being restructured. I'm not going to say that it's not the case throughout the whole economy, but on what Didier said on those challenges, it's a question of democracy. Sorry, I didn't answer to the end of the question on the concentration of media in the hands of a few industry captains. Let's not be afraid. Thank God, otherwise they would have disappeared. So I hope that the concentration in industry, the industrial groups, it depends what you do with them, but if the industrial groups are not here to consolidate and regroup, invest massively to protect the quality and the reliability of the information, it's not the local and regional press by itself who's going to be able to get there. So let's move on and talk about all the solutions, because now we have made a diagnostic and we're going to try now to find a cure of the disease, a few solutions. At France 24, Vanessa, how do you act? Well, first of all, it was interesting, your question on financing, which is a major question. The public audiovisual sector has some budget cuts that are very important. And this issue, it creates a lot of problems, because in order to deliver reliable information, we need means. We need to send some journalists on the ground to measure the information, to make documentaries, to have some foreign correspondents everywhere in the world. We have over 200 correspondents in the world that send us information from the ground, because what we need, the real facts, comes from information on the ground. And this information costs a lot of money, so the public media needs money. We have a cell at France 24, which is called the Observers. We have a number of citizens throughout the world who actually escalate some information or allow us to check some information that we're going to put on air. And we have journalists who are experts of disinformation, who are experts of, and they debunk every day and they demystify fake news. So we run some specific programs that we broadcast. These programs are very educational, because it's not just about debunking an info, it's about explaining where it comes from and what it's the likelihood to get viral. If it's a weak one, well, if we debunk it, we may make it more viral. And what is the goal of this fake information?
That's the work we do every single day at France 24 and at France Media World. Another avenue that we could explore to find a solution is European medias should unite to combat this fake news. We need to have a big wall, a stone wall, to combat this fake news. There are so many roundtables that I participated in, and we've talked a lot about an allegiance, a European allegiance for defence, but the information war also has to be part of our defence. Perhaps it should be part of the defence budget. And at France Media Monde, we have got an information shield which we've developed with the Deutsche Welle in Germany, and also partners of public TV in Poland. But let me give you a figure. France Media Monde, we have 280 million euros per year. That means that if you compare it, Russia devotes, these are the figures which have come through to us, between 2 and 4 billion euros per year to create false news, to send out false news. So we have a tiny budget compared to the Russian budget or the Chinese budget or even the Turkish budget. So Vanessa, do you use AI to combat fake information, fake news? I talked with the boss of Vigimin, I don't know if he's in the room. Do you have any contacts? Because in this war against false news, we have to include the ministers of information, and we work with Martin Briand, who's director of Envisioning, but they are a state player, a state service here in France, which alerts and analyzes fake news. We work very closely with them, with Viginum. We use it mainly, and it is also important because AI is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in many ways. We use it to do transcription when we need it. And if we want to debunk a piece of fake news, you have to do it in many languages. You have a greater impact. So we use AI to do our translations there. For our network, we work in 22 languages. So AI generates false videos, false news really, really quickly and sends them out at breakneck speed. Yeah, but AI can also be used to detect fake news. This is true. Maya, perhaps you'd like to bounce back on this one, on this question of an alliance in Europe. You might also want to say a word about regulations. There's DSA, there's BMA. There have been some initiatives in Europe. How do you see this? Is the European Commission doing enough? Is it speaking out loud enough to be heard by the Americans, for example?
Well, I work on the topic for the past plus 10 years, and definitely what I see is a change, and there's more understanding of what disinformation is, why influence operations are jeopardizing our democracy and our freedom. And definitely European Commission is doing a lot. They also built the Resilience Center recently, and they are bringing what we call a whole of the society approach. So it's not only uniting with the media, but it's also uniting with the civil society actors, media, and the governments. And I think that's the only solution. If we really want to fight the issue, we really need to come together and bring the expertise that's already there. If we are working with Alliance for Europe for the past 7 years or 8 years on the topic, right? We really have a great expertise on it. And bringing few of the solutions that we have on the table and that we are already working on is, first of all, we have a disarm framework. And disarm framework is being used by several different governments, European Commission and NATO. And it's a common language for researching disinformation. So if you're thinking about influence operations, there are different tactics, techniques, and procedures, or different ways how we can be influenced. And what is important, there are several other people and organizations that are researchers and looking at it, right? So what we did, we built a framework that is an open source and is giving that to organizations and people to check what is happening. And you can actually look at those influence operations before they become viral. And that's even more important than the debunking. If we're going to understand in time that there is an attack, you can do actually a pre-bunking and a lot of other solutions. And if you are having this whole of the society approach, and one of the solutions for it is, for example, ISAC, that is Information Sharing Analysis Center. So it's also bringing different partners working, for example, on elections, and then sharing what is happening and then knowing how to approach. You can really defend the information space. And that's very important. We also, as Alliance for Europe, has a CDN network that gathers more than 100 organizations around the world that are working on countering disinformation. And we can see that the approach of influence operations is not on a state basis, right? It's rather based on the human development. And what is happening is very well known on how the vulnerability is working. And I'm going to ask say one more thing, because I think that it's not only about regulations, and there are DSA and DMA, and that's great to do, but we also need to have the ID on the internet, because right now there is bots and basically all the agents that can change the way how the internet is working and using, and that's what we have. So we need to know who is in the internet. We need to stop saying that it's only a freedom space, because we really need to just know who we are, as we know in here, and then have a debate, because it's a dangerous space right now, and we need to make it safe.
Thank you, Maya. Philippe Caduc.
Philippe Caduc, we've taken a look back in history. Now let's look at the present and perhaps the future as well. So how are we going to detect what's true and what's not true? And what's the problem for democracy? Businesses today are also faced with these risks of manipulation, interference, and economic information, economic intelligence. So what's your view? Well, our job is to inform businesses and to help them to anticipate with their actions for their strategies. And in a minefield of information, we want to inform businesses on geopolitical risks, on technological breakthroughs, etc., disruptive technologies, on their retaliation, which they could implement if they've been attacked. So that's what we've been doing for the past 30 years. Before that, I was in the intelligence service. The rule remains the same. Information colors decisions. So the truth of information, to come back to the subject today, is undergoing two trends. One pertains to the sources and the other to the receivers of information. We have business leaders and company heads, and we have the general population. First of all, the sources are worldwide. They're global. What happened today in the royal court in Saudi Arabia or in the United States has to color the decisions taken by business leaders. Secondly, knowledge is no longer the remit of institutions. There are today individuals and groups of individuals who can construct an analysis grid which is just as robust as that created by an expert. When we were in the COVID crisis, there was this famous battalion which constituted lots of information about the numbers of people who were contaminated because they see how many people were going to the crematorium. The Chinese government tried to change those figures. When American officers at the Pentagon were working at night, that would indicate that there was more intense or imminent military action. And the foreign powers would identify how many pizzas were ordered into the White House in the middle of the night to know how the scope of the teams that were working there. It sounds funny, but it was quite efficient. Information sources make the difference between secret sources and public sources, and that difference has changed. Snowden talked a lot about the NSA. The Panama Papers, which we're all familiar with, revealed lots of offshore edifices, with the risk, as we know today, that information is destined to become new. We have no confidentiality anymore. What is hidden today will be revealed tomorrow. And sometimes at a scale of time, which means you lose all context. What I'm getting at here is that today businesses are experiencing an acceleration of all this due to technology. 50% of world data production comes from the social media. 40% of toxic information on social network is identical. It's all the same. We know that in the future, the vast majority of images which are going to be online will be either produced or touched up by AI. We know that large language models produce a rate of hallucinations, i.e. they produce factually incorrect information with a high reliability rate. And these are not bugs. This is consubstantial to the neurons that are in place, these transformers that produce text and series of tokens, which mean that 20 to 30% of errors are produced by these LLMs. I would add information latencies with the LLM. So the information that you're given today isn't necessarily fresh. And there are cultural slants, there are political slants, mostly in English language, mostly generated by institutions, but there is, and I believe this, the fact that the algorithm can only infer what a human brain can understand. I'm talking about those things which remain unsaid and political slants, etc. So we need to check our sources of information. By the same token, at the receptor side, we have to evolve. Any company head needs to know what's going on, and they need to check the scope of information before it takes into consideration. I'm not talking about ordinary slants. I'm talking about these LLMs, which mean that we tend to accept as true a piece of information which has been delivered in a smooth and convincing way. That's the calling card of the LLM. I'm not talking either about those comfort zones where we always give higher credit to something which backs up our own beliefs rather than something which challenges them. Business leaders have got 2 or 3 slants which are really important. The first will modify how information is received and incorporated into decision making. And that's reputation. In the business world, there's a huge pressure. There's the NGOs, associations, sometimes the media, meaning that the company head isn't always addressing the right question, i.e. what is the best for the social value of my company, but what are people going to say about it? What's the risk on my company image? And that really is biasing the way information is. And there's a legal risk as well, a criminal risk. And so it's very disproportionate in the way information is analyzed. So there's the Lafarge case, which ended up in a 6-year jail sentence for a CAC 40 business leader, and it triggered a shockwave which is continuing to ripple. So you have to think about the sources, you have to think about complexity. It doesn't mean that we can't tell the true from the false, but what I'm trying to say is that today there's an excess of information, there's cognitive exhaustion. We need to be able to place in an order of importance. And that means that business leaders have to be able to decipher the world in a different way today. A business leader is obviously a good manager, has got charisma, knows the business sector. In the future, it's going to be even more complicated than that. The business leader is going to have to enshrine information, and to select information, and realize the information that flows in isn't always correct. Getting back to Orwell, for states as for businesses, we're going to have a ministry of truth. Well, that could be another subject. Etienne, perhaps you'd like to take a couple of moments to talk about slop AI. AI slop. In a nutshell, I don't really agree with what I've just heard. I think he's got a very doom and gloom view. I believe at the end of the year, there is going to be an obligation for all LLMs to be transparent. AI, the European AI Act is going to broach the subject. As you mentioned, AI, there's an AI measure here in France which is very efficient. So we use a tool already. There are 2 things that are going to happen. Firstly, a language model is like a coffee percolator. 50% of human language is generated synthetically. 50% of internet is generated synthetically. When my clients want to see what their brands are generating online, they generate virtual people, they generate online text, which balances the reputation. At the end of the day, so you're no longer writing for Google, you're writing for AI. So we're going to end up with, a huge percentage of internet being generated by AI. So how can we make sure that this ecosystem is strengthened? Other questions are transparency of information, diversity. Didier, let's try and trundle towards our conclusion. Marc Bloch has a quote here. I'm optimistic on AI because AI will mean that AI will need journalists, will not destroy them. Marc Bloch was saying that the search for truth relies on methodology which compares sources, a critical mind, and verification of the facts. Trust is never given to a statement, but to a methodology. And let's say, long live unfettered journalism. Well, it's hard to follow in the footsteps of Marc Bloch, but here I go. Several tools are necessary to guarantee the reliability of information and the independence of the media, and that they are economically viable. We have to reform the concentration of media, which is based on an ancient law, which does not take into account the weight of information on internet, for example, because it said you're not allowed to own more than a certain number of newspapers or a certain number of radio channels. It's completely out of date. In Germany and England, for example, they've got regulation against concentration, which is very efficient. It takes into account the power of the media, including internet. We also have to provide guarantees on the independence of what is written in the different media. And I agree with Didier Q to say that we're delighted that industrial groups are buying out media, because otherwise they would just shut shop and they would no longer exist. However, this purchase must come hand in hand with a guarantee of independence for the editorial team. Independence is always a struggle. Advertising now, the different measures which are being discussed today to get advertisers to invest in the media, that's one way. And we've got those people who produce news, it's not necessarily the traditional media. We should give them a quality label that means that they have to respect certain levels. So all of this can be very coherent, a raft of measures. It's quite curious because every time we talk about these conclusions of these meetings that we've had about information, people say, oh yes, it's essential that we do this, that and the other, the conclusions which you arrived at. And once again, I'm saying it again, I'm repeating myself, but so far nothing has happened. There is a draft law which has been examined by the State Council, which is ready to go before the ministers, but it has not yet been put before the ministers. Well, this is a subject we all agree on, so it's a good political subject. So, thank you very much. We're going to have the wrap-up of the whole conference very, very soon. So.